What happens when two powerful nations, once sworn to avoid conflict, suddenly turn on each other? History is full of strange partnerships, but few are as shocking, or as destructive, as the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union during World War II. On paper, it was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in 1939. To the world, it looked like a peace treaty, a promise that the two superpowers would stay out of each other's way. But behind closed doors, there was a chilling secret. Germany and the Soviet Union had secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them, slicing up Poland and other nations like a pie. For a brief moment, it seemed like both sides had secured their futures. But here's where the story takes a brutal twist. Just 2 years later, Adolf Hitler betrayed Joseph Stalin. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest military invasions in history, sending millions of soldiers into Soviet territory. The alliance that was meant to protect both powers instantly shattered, and what followed was a nightmare. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and the Eastern Front became one of the bloodiest battlefields humanity has ever seen. What was supposed to be a pact of convenience turned into a disaster of epic proportions. By the end, Hitler's betrayal not only devastated the Soviet Union, but also set the stage for Germany's own downfall, as the Red Army pushed back with brutal force all the way to Berlin. And here's the thing, this was just the first example. If you think this alliance was disastrous, wait until you see what happened when other nations tried to outsmart history. Stick with me until the end, because the #1 backfired alliance might just shock you the most. What if the people you trusted to stand by you in a war simply walked away? Worse yet, joined the enemy. That's exactly what happened with the Triple Alliance, one of the most fragile partnerships in history. Back in 1882, Europe was a powder keg of rivalries. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy decided to band together, signing what became known as the Triple Alliance. On paper, it sounded like a solid pact. They promised that if any of them was attacked, the others would rush to their defense. It was supposed to be about balance, strength, and numbers. For Germany and Austria-Hungary, it also meant keeping Italy close, instead of letting her fall into the hands of their enemies. But here's the truth. Italy never felt completely loyal to this alliance. Unlike Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italy had its own ambitions, and some of those ambitions clashed directly with its so-called friends. For years, the pact held together, mostly because no one wanted to test it. But everything changed in 1914, when World War I erupted. Germany and Austria-Hungary expected Italy to honor the alliance. After all, that was the deal. But Italy looked at the situation carefully and hesitated. Why? Because the alliance was technically defensive. It required members to fight only if one of them was attacked. Italy argued that Germany and Austria-Hungary weren't being attacked. They were the ones who had declared war. That gave Italy a way out, at least in their eyes. At first, Italy stayed neutral, sitting on the sidelines as the war grew larger and bloodier. But neutrality didn't last long. Behind closed doors, Italy began secret talks with the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia. These talks led to the Treaty of London in 1915, where the Allies promised Italy land and power if they switched sides. And just like that, Italy betrayed the Triple Alliance. Think about the shock. Germany and Austria-Hungary had counted on Italy as a partner, maybe even as a buffer against the Allies. Instead, Italy turned on them, joining the enemy and fighting against its former allies. What was once a triangle of strength broke apart like fragile glass. This betrayal had huge consequences. Austria-Hungary suddenly had to fight on a whole new front against Italy, stretching their forces thin. Germany had to divert attention and resources. The alliance that was meant to guarantee safety ended up weakening them instead. And the irony? Italy didn't even gain everything it was promised after the war. Despite switching sides, the rewards Italy expected never fully came, leaving the country bitter and disappointed. The Triple Alliance is a classic reminder that alliances built on shaky ground rarely last. Trust matters more than signatures on a treaty. For Italy, loyalty was negotiable. Whoever offered the best deal could win them over. And for Germany and Austria-Hungary, that betrayal was a hard lesson in how fragile international promises can be. When we look back, the Triple Alliance stands as one of history's greatest examples of how an agreement designed to prevent war can actually accelerate disaster. Instead of protecting its members, it pulled them into chaos and betrayal, changing the course of World War I. And here's the kicker. This wasn't the last time a powerful nation armed and supported someone, only to regret it later. In fact, the next alliance on our list shows what happens when a short-term strategy in war plants the seeds for decades of conflict. Stay tuned, because what the United States did in Afghanistan during the Cold War still echoes in our world today. What if the very people you once armed, trained, and funded turned into your deadliest enemies? That's exactly what happened between the United States and the Taliban. It's a story that began during the Cold War, but ended up shaping the 21st century in ways no one could have imagined. Let's rewind to the late 1970s. Afghanistan was in turmoil. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded, hoping to prop up a communist government. To the U.S., this invasion wasn't just about Afghanistan. It was another chapter in the Cold War, another chance to block Soviet influence. So, Washington made a decision: support the Afghan fighters, known as the Mujahideen, who were resisting Soviet control. At first, it seemed like a clever move. The U.S. didn't want to send its own soldiers, but it was willing to pour in money, weapons, and training. Billions of dollars flowed into Afghanistan through a program known as Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in American history. Advanced weapons like Stinger missiles were handed over to Afghan fighters, giving them the power to shoot down Soviet helicopters and planes. To the world, these Mujahideen looked like freedom fighters, brave men defending their homeland from superpower. American leaders even praised them. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan called them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. The message was clear: the U.S. saw them as allies, partners in the fight against communism. And at first it worked. By 1989, the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan, humiliated and broken. On paper, it looked like a victory for the United States. They had achieved their goal without sending a single American soldier into combat. But here's where the alliance began to twist into something far more dangerous. After the Soviets left, Afghanistan didn't stabilize. Instead, the country fell into civil war. Different factions of the Mujahideen fought for power, and out of this chaos, a new group began to rise: the Taliban. Many of its fighters had roots in the U.S.-backed resistance. They had the weapons, the training, and the battle experience gained during the Soviet War. By the mid-1990s, the Taliban had taken over most of Afghanistan, enforcing a strict and brutal interpretation of Islamic law. The United States, once their biggest supporter, now found itself watching as Afghanistan turned into a safe haven for extremists. And among those extremists was Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind al-Qaeda. With the Taliban's protection, bin Laden planned and launched attacks that shook the entire world, culminating in the devastating events of September 11th, 2001. Think about that for a moment. The alliance that was supposed to weaken the Soviet Union had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. By arming and empowering Afghan fighters, the U.S. had unknowingly helped create the conditions for its own future tragedy. What began as a tactical Cold War victory ended up sparking decades of terrorism, war, and loss. After September 11th, the U.S. returned to Afghanistan, this time not as allies, but as invaders, determined to destroy the very group it once helped empower. The war dragged on for 20 years, costing trillions of dollars and countless lives. And in the end, when American forces finally left in 2021, the Taliban was back in power, almost exactly where they had been decades earlier. The lesson? Sometimes the enemy of your enemy can become your greatest nightmare. What looks like a smart alliance in the moment can plant seeds of chaos that last for generations. And this is only the third story on our list. If you think this backfire was shocking, wait until you see how alliances between old rivals like Britain and the United States twisted into unexpected conflicts. The next one shows how even long-term partnerships can falter when history hasn't healed old wounds. What if the country you now call your closest ally once stood on the opposite side of the battlefield, trying to keep you weak and divided? Believe it or not, that's exactly what happened between Britain and the United States. Today, we think of them as partners, standing shoulder to shoulder in wars, trade, and diplomacy. But back in the early 1800s, their alliance was fragile, their history raw, and their trust almost non-existent. The roots of this story go back to the American Revolution. The United States was born out of rebellion against the British Crown. By the time independence was won, there was still bad blood. Britain, the world's strongest empire, didn't like the idea of losing its colonies. And America, still young and fragile, was trying to prove it could stand on its own. Tensions simmered for decades, but by the early 1800s, those tensions boiled over. Britain was locked in a massive war with Napoleonic France, and it began interfering with American trade. American ships were stopped, cargo seized, and, most infuriating of all, thousands of American sailors were kidnapped by the British Navy, a practice known as impressment. To the U.S., this was more than harassment. It was an insult to its sovereignty. But that wasn't the only problem. Britain was also accused of supporting Native American tribes in their resistance against American expansion into the frontier. To American leaders, it felt like Britain was trying to box them in, stop them from growing, and keep the young nation. By 1812, patience had run out. The U.S. declared war on Britain. It was supposed to be a short fight, a chance for America to assert itself, and maybe even expand into Canada. Instead, the war turned into a bitter and costly struggle. The British, despite being busy with Napoleon in Europe, still had one of the strongest navies in the world. They blockaded American ports, crushed U.S. trade, and even marched into Washington, D.C., setting the White House on fire in 1814. For a moment, it looked like the United States might collapse under the weight of its former ruler's power. But here's where things took a strange turn. Despite the destruction, neither side managed to land a decisive blow. Battles raged across the Atlantic coast, the Great Lakes, and even deep in the American frontier. The war dragged on with heavy losses, but no real gains. By the time peace was signed in 1815, in the Treaty of Ghent, both nations walked away with nothing. No territory changed hands. No big demands were met. It was essentially a draw. So how does this connect to alliances that backfired? Because Britain's attempt to weaken the United States had the opposite effect. Instead of breaking the young nation's spirit, the war strengthened American identity. Victories like the Battle of New Orleans, where General Andrew Jackson became a national hero, fueled a new sense of pride. Americans began to see themselves not as fragile survivors, but as a nation that could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest empire on earth. For Britain, the war was more of a headache than a victory. Supporting native tribes and clashing with the U.S. didn't stop America's growth, it accelerated it. Within a few decades, the U.S. was rising as a powerful force, one Britain could no longer ignore or suppress. Eventually, the two nations realized that cooperation was better than conflict. Ironically, the failed attempt to hold America back laid the foundation for one of the strongest alliances in modern history. The lesson here? Even the mightiest empire can miscalculate. Britain's hostility only fueled American strength, and what was once an enemy became a partner out of necessity. But not all alliances end in a draw or unexpected friendship. Some lead to total disaster. And in our final example, you'll see how Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany not only backfired, but also sealed their fate in World War II. What if the alliance you thought would make you unstoppable actually pulled you straight into defeat? That's the story of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, two powers who thought they could divide the world, but instead ended up destroying themselves. By the late 1930s, the world was edging closer to total war. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had already begun its march across Europe. Japan, on the other hand, was expanding aggressively in Asia, invading China, and eyeing new territories for its empire. Both nations had something in common: ambition. They wanted more land, more resources, and more power. And in their minds, teaming up was the way to get it. In 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, officially forming the Axis powers. The idea was simple. If one of them was attacked, the others would come to its defense. Together, they believed they could dominate both Europe and Asia. On paper, it looked like an alliance that could terrify the world. But alliances built on aggression, rather than trust, rarely last long without consequences. Germany's focus was Europe. Hitler was obsessed with conquering land to the east, especially the Soviet Union. Japan's focus, meanwhile, was the Pacific. They wanted control over the seas and access to vital resources like oil and rubber. At first, their goals didn't overlap, so the alliance seemed convenient. But convenience is a dangerous foundation for loyalty. The turning point came in December 1941, when Japan made a bold and catastrophic move. On December 7th, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The attack crippled much of America's Pacific Fleet. Japan believed this strike would knock the United States out of the war before it could even begin. What they didn't expect was the fury it unleashed. Instead of staying out of the conflict, the United States entered World War II the very next day. And because Japan was tied to Germany through the Axis Pact, America declared war on both. Suddenly, what was meant to be an alliance of strength became a death sentence. For Hitler, Japan's attack was a disaster in disguise. Until then, he had been fighting Britain and the Soviet Union, but not the United States. With Pearl Harbor, he suddenly had another powerful enemy to face, a nation with vast industrial power, enormous resources, and the determination to fight until victory. The alliance began to unravel. Germany and Japan didn't even coordinate well. They had different priorities, fought in different theaters of war, and rarely shared meaningful strategies. While Germany was struggling on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, Japan was locked in a brutal fight across the Pacific against American forces. Instead of multiplying their power, the Axis partners fought separate wars, both doomed to fail. By 1945, the consequences were clear. Germany collapsed first, with the Red Army storming Berlin. A few months later, Japan surrendered after the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The grand vision of the Axis powers had turned into ashes. So why did this alliance backfire so badly? Because it was built on arrogance and short-term goals. Germany and Japan both assumed the world would fall easily before them. They underestimated their enemies, overestimated their own strength, and trusted each other only as long as it was convenient. Their partnership didn't protect them. It dragged them into a war they couldn't win. Looking back, the Axis Pact stands as one of history's most destructive alliances. Instead of securing dominance, it guaranteed defeat. And it serves as a reminder that power-hungry friendships often burn out faster than they. Now we've reached the end of our list, but here's the big question. Which of these alliances do you think was the most disastrous? Was it Hitler betraying Stalin, Italy turning its back on Germany, or Japan dragging Germany into a fight with the United States? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget, history is full of lessons. Some of them are warnings. And if you've stayed with me this far, here's your reward. The knowledge that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Hitler and Stalin thought they could divide Europe. Instead, they unleashed one of the bloodiest wars in history. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy believed unity would protect them, but Italy's betrayal shattered the alliance and left the others exposed. The U.S. empowered Afghan fighters to weaken the Soviets, only to face the Taliban and decades of conflict later. Britain tried to keep America weak, but the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate that actually made the U.S. stronger. And Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, tied to its Axis pact with Germany, brought America into the war and sealed the Axis fate. The lesson is clear. Power built on shaky trust never lasts. Short-term wins often create long-term disasters. And when ambition outweighs loyalty, alliances don't just crumble, they explode. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these alliances do you think was the biggest mistake in history? Was it Italy turning on its allies? The U.S. unintentionally empowering its future enemy? Or Japan dragging Germany into a war with the United States? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if you found this journey through history eye-opening, here's your reward. Knowing that the past is more than old stories. It's a guidebook. By studying how these alliances backfired, we understand not just history, but the fragile balance of today's world. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more untold history, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Because if history has one guarantee, it's this: the alliances of today may become tomorrow's disasters. By studying how these alliances backfired, we understand not just history, but the fragile balance of today's world. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more untold history, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Because if history has one guarantee, it's this: the alliances of today may become tomorrow's disasters. Because if history has one guarantee, it's this: the alliances of today may become tomorrow's disasters.